Need approval of the minutes. Motion second. Any comment? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Do we have anybody signed up for public comment? Okay. Then we get down to business here. Bobby?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your service on the committee. What I want to try to accomplish today is kind of review the ordinance itself and some other supporting documents. I want to try to do all of this as quickly as I can. I think that will maybe minimize the confusion and give you guys time for questions and answers, that type of thing. Just so you'll know, we're doing this today. The first reading for the budget is scheduled the day after tomorrow, and then the second reading on a week from then on June the 27th. And of course, the deadline is June the 30th. So just beginning on the first page of the ordinance, I just want to point out that there's a couple of TCO statutes that kind of govern the budget process. One says we have to have a budget and it has to be funded with available funds, and the other one basically says that every expenditure of the city has to be appropriated. And our budget process is kind of how we do that. So I'd encourage you to move to page 2. I'm going to restrict my comments to the general, the big fund, the larger funds, not those minor funds, unless you have questions about those. And the format, by the way, is very similar to what you see on this first page. So you got the fund, then you have actual FY23, estimated actual FY24. This is kind of based on our best estimate as of the end of March, and we've adjusted some things since then that we know about, and then next year's budget. So beginning with the general fund at the top here, you can see that in next year's budget, we are budgeted for $95,692,103 in revenues. If you compare that to FY24 revenues, on the surface, that represents a 4.7% increase in revenue. However, it's important to note that there is a material amount of revenue in FY24 that the city recognized from the Exit 85 TIF, closing that TIF of $2.2 million, almost 2.3. So if you take that out of FY24 and then compare the revenue for FY25, there's a 7.4% increase in revenue. Now, I'll just tell you, and by the way, we have the detailed revenues and expense reports for your review later on, but if you sort of look at normal recurring types of revenues year over year, there's very, what I would describe as modest growth in kind of recurring revenues, taxes, state shared revenues, that type of thing, somewhere around 1.5% to 2%, depending on what you're looking at. The rest of this growth in revenue is a transition of property tax, which this year has been going to the debt service fund, and next year will be going to the general fund. And we'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. So that's kind of the revenue side of things. If you look at expenses, $98,778,061, that represents a 7.8% growth in projected expenses year over year. Now, if you'll find the line that says, the third line there from the bottom says revenue over and under appropriations, you can see that in 2023, the general fund basically broke even with a small deficit of $96,000. Kind of very similar projected results. These are estimated results for 2024. And then currently the proposed budget for next year is reflecting expenditures or appropriations exceeding revenues by $3,078,758. Now, so the question is, how do we move forward? So the way this budget is prepared, or this ordinance is prepared in discussions with the mayor, would be to move forward with basically a continued spend down of the fund balance, right? Now, I would share some numbers with you. The fund balance as a percent of operating expenses in the general fund back in 23 was 28.9%. FY24 is projected at 27.4%. And should we move forward as this version of the budget is proposed, that number would drop to 22.3%. I have another worksheet here in just a second. I'll show this in a little bit more detail. Of course, another option would be to, a property tax increase could be considered as another option, and I will just go ahead and tell you that, I'll show you again here in a second, but a penny on the property tax rate generates about $217,100 and some odd dollars. So, to fund this current deficit would take about an increase of about 14 cents on the tax rate, which is about a 10 or 11% increase. So that's the story on the general fund as it sits today. I'm gonna skip the
What was
smaller
that
fund.
percent for this next budget?
What's it?
Right,
Oh,
29,
22.3.
Okay.
You have that, I'll show you on another sheet here in just a second. So I'm gonna skip the smaller funds, I'm gonna move to page 3, the solid waste fund. This is health and sanitation, solid waste services, right? So revenues are projected right now flat flat for next year. There's no rate increase, no increase in charges or anything like that. And those revenues total $14.6 million. Expenses right now are budgeted next year at $14.9 million. That's about a 7.5% decrease from this year. Now, let me speak to that very quickly. Back in FY '24, we had a high the solid waste fund funds their own capital, right? So they pay for their own capital. That number was $723,000 more in FY '24 than is proposed for FY '25. Okay. The other thing is we have a contract with the operator of the landfill. Back in 2024, there was a really substantial CPE increase in charges for the landfill. That is moderated some now under the contract. So actually, there's about an $875,000 decrease in our projected landfill cost for next year. And then the third thing I would tell you that's a little new for this year is that the budget for the solid waste fund reflects the cost associated with the new 311 call center. Okay. But with all of that said, FY '25 is for the solid waste fund is, with this budget anyway, is projected to count, basically a small loss of $330,000, pretty much a break even to a small loss. Okay, moving forward, I'm gonna skip page 4. Those are a couple of small funds. Gonna move to page 5 very quickly, the debt service fund. So currently, I think we've discussed in this committee before, this is the year where we experience a substantial decrease in the debt service for our bond payments. In fact, if you look down at the bottom where we list all of the debt, and if you look at account, it's about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6th or 7th line down, account 54040, 2019 bond principal. You can see this year it was 8.5 million, next year is 2.965 million. So as a result of that, the way we're proposing to fund the debt service next year, there's 2 sources of revenue. There's the property tax that it would require to fund the debt service revenue, and then there's also a projected payment from the CRA that they committed to help fund the lease on Madison High School. So those are the 2 sources of revenue for the debt service fund for next year. And you can see the expenses at $6,475,000, and so it'd basically be a break-even budget next year for the debt service fund. So, okay. Any questions about that? I know I'm moving really quickly. Okay. Capital outlay fund. So we need to talk about this one. This will be the top of page 6. So again, here in a second, when we kind of get through the resolution, I'm going to have some schedules on the general fund, debt service, capital outlay that'll give you a little bit more detail about these particular numbers. But basically right now, the way the capital outlay fund is prepared at this point is we are only including projects or expenses, if you will, in the capital outlay fund that have a funding source. So a number of those are what we refer to as carryover items from the prior year. So what that means is they were budgeted in the prior year, They were encumbered and started, right, but not completed, so those budget funds carry over. They're kind of part of the ending fund balance from the prior year. So they're in there. Also what's in there are, some capital projects that are grant funded. You'll see them in detail here in just a second, but they're primarily, transportation, projects, types of projects. So that's sort of where we are today, and I think when I review with you here in a second, the more detailed sheet, this will all become a little bit clearer to you. But while we are here on this, I would just, the mayor and I have had some discussions. When you start thinking about, okay, we got these capital needs, so how do we fund them, right? So, our city's been fortunate, in recent years, but, you know, most cities, larger and smaller than Jackson, when it comes time to funding, capital projects that have, or assets that with a long useful life, right, those are usually done through debt issues, where you can amortize and pay for the asset over the life of the asset itself. That would be something that this committee and the council would need to consider, as we move forward. And I'll share a little bit more
Like we
detail
have a
with
home
you
loan,
about that.
personally, the city borrows that money.
Similar, yeah, very similar, yeah. So if you can just kind of hold that, when we look at a detailed sheet here and just say it may make a little bit more sense, so.
The details will describe the intergovernmental amount? Is that from grants or?
The intergovernmental amount there's two sources on there. There's property taxes, plus it's the payment from the CRA that they committed to help with Madison. Yeah, the detail breaks all that out, so.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll move to, let's see. If you just look at the bottom of page 7, just very quickly, the ARPA fund. I know there's a lot of discussion about ARPA. This fund's a little different, the way that this works. Of course, ARPA was new to us. It was new to everybody. It's kind of evolved over the last 2 or 3 years or so. But your revenue is not, we've got the cash. We got the cash way back in, I guess, 21 or something. Whenever that was, 21. But you don't get to recognize the revenue until the funds are expended. And that literally means they're paid for, not encumbered, but expended, right? So that's kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So what you see in the FY '25 budget for the ARPA fund, you may recall, those of you that were on the council, or you've probably heard about it, when we first got the ARPA funds, the city council adopted I think we refer to it as a spend plan, right? Mm-hmm. So over time, and those things are still intact for the most part, and over time, the council has passed budget amendments to kind of move money from one spend line item to another, so that's taken place. But then the other thing that happens kind of up in the purchasing office and the accounting office, there comes a point where those funds that are budgeted for the spend plan are encumbered, right? That's when, a purchase order is issued or a contract is signed or something like that. And then the final piece of it is when we actually pay for them. And that's when it's expense, and that's when we can recognize the revenue. So basically, this $6.1 million in revenue and expenses that you see for next year, that's the balance from purchasing, the way I understand it, that remains on items that were part of the spend plan. They're adjusted by budget amendments. Some of them, most of them, but not all of them, have been encumbered, but they've not yet been paid for. Right, so we just rebudget that each year, so that's what that number is. Okay. Page 8, very quickly, section 2, as part of the budget ordinance, the comptroller asked us to kind of attest to ending fund balances, right, that we think we're gonna have in the various funds at June 30th, 24. So that's what that is. The reason that's important is because you can pass a balanced budget based on available funds. Revenues less expenses, and then if expenses exceed revenues, you can use the fund balance if it's available. So that's the reason you have to kind of attest to that, if you will. Section 3, just another comptroller requirement. It's just this schedule of our debt, what we understand it will be at June 30th of 24, and then the principal and interest payments that are required in FY 25. Okay, on, the next page, page 9, section 4, this is kind of again, a comptroller issue on how they like to see the budget ordinance prepared. So these are a list of the capital projects that are included in the budget for next year. The chart at the top recognizes those items that we internally describe as carryover items, so you can see which ones those are. And then the chart at the bottom reflects kind of the new items that are grant funded. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. Okay, page 10 of the ordinance, in the middle of the page, this is the proposed property tax rate and allocation for the FY25 budget. The total at this point remains at 1.6114. That's the current tax rate. That's the proposed tax rate for next year. Now, there's a difference in the allocation if you want to write these numbers down, although it's on another piece of paper here in just a second. The general fund, for the current tax rate for the general fund right now is 1.1360. And you can see that increases to 1.3132 next year. And the debt service is 0.4754, and that decreases to 0.2982, but the total doesn't change. Okay, you'll see that again here in just a second. So that's the ordinance itself. A quick one, quickly. If you'll just flip through a couple of other pages, you'll see a little schedule like this. It says general fund at the top. And this information I've already talked about. I just want you to see it in a little bit different form, right? So you can see the general fund, FY23, 24, and 25. These are the same numbers that were on the schedule in the ordinance, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see those fund balance percentages as a percent of expenses that I shared with you. And below that, you can see the property, kind of the property tax analysis, right? What it is in FY24, what it is proposed for FY25 as this ordinance is drafted, and what it would look like if the council should consider a tax increase. So pretty straightforward, but this gives you all the information right there. Okay, flip it ahead. The next page, I think, is a debt service summary. Just a little different format, but a little bit easier for you to read. But we've covered this pretty thoroughly already, so I don't really have any additional comments on that one. I think the next one in your packet, hopefully, is a little summary about the capital outlay fund. Can you locate that one? Everybody got that one? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the stuff at the very top is right off the budget ordinance that you've already looked at. It's a little bit easier to read like this. Now, kind of in the middle of the page is a little bit of is a breakdown, if you will, of revenues and projects, sources of capital revenue for next year, and projects for next year as well, and it kind of details them out. So, and you know, as I mentioned earlier, we're estimating to have about $2.5 million of fund balance at June 30th of 24, which will carry over to the budget for next year. So,
multimodal, that's the sidewalk.
It's Parkway.
Parkway.
Yeah. So now, in talking with the mayor, working with the mayor, we thought it would be a good idea just to kind of give the council and the budget committee just kind of some idea of what either spend down the fund balance like we've discussed, show what a property tax increase option might look like, and then the other option as it relates to the capital outlay fund, as I mentioned earlier, the way that many cities finance their capital needs, particularly when there are things like buildings and vehicles and heavy pieces of equipment and things that have a long useful life, is a debt issue. So rates are very, I guess, unpredictable might be the best word right now. But I just did a little research, and it would suggest that municipal bonds, tax exempt financing, depending on what type of tax exempt financing we might pursue, there's capital outlay notes, there's municipal bonds, there's private placement, there's lots of different ways to do it. Might be somewhere between 3% and 4%. So I just used this example down here at the bottom. I just looked at 3%, 4%, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, and you can just kind of get some feel for, what that would look like. Now, that varies depending on some details. For instance, the useful life of the assets that we would be financing would impact that. The rate, the interest rate, or the type of financing. Again, a bond issue, capital outlay note, a bank note, private placement, that all varies. And certainly, the structure of our current remaining debt service, the other debt that we have, and then the structure that might be recommended for the new debt all of that would impact things. Our credit rating, our debt capacity. I was sharing with the mayor. The good news is that the city's not had a bond issue anyway since 2020, 2019, I guess it was, which is last time we did that, went through that process, the city had a AA rating. I have I guess, sort of annual email, phone calls, discussions with different rating agencies, and they ask for our audit every year. I have no reason to think that rating would be any less, but you do have to go through that process. I do think the city has debt capacity. I don't think there's any question about that. So those are some things that you might consider and could be considered for the council as well as this particular committee. Last time the city used a financial advisor. I think that's a wise thing to do. I would probably recommend that again, but we would certainly be consulting with those types of people should the city council decide to move forward with something like that. And another opportunity that I shared with the mayor that you can do is kind of once you identify kind of the assets you're thinking about financing, you can pass what's called a reimbursement resolution, which basically what it does is it would allow the city, once the debt issue comes to fruition and the funds available, we could reimburse ourselves for assets that we purchased between now and then, basically is what that does. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Now, if you can see this long page, I think y'all probably seen this before. This is the document that our city uses to kind of track and summarize budget requests. And also, we ask our department heads to look ahead for 4 more future years so that we got a 5-year plan. I give you this just so you will know what all was included in the request. And the items that are highlighted in green are the ones that are currently funded, as I described earlier. So you can look at that and
is this what you call green? Or
no,
what
it's
you call?
the bright green.
Okay.
And as you're looking at that, the final documents in the back of your report package are the kind of the detailed revenue and expense accounts by budget by accounts, account level and fund level. So, okay. I know I went through that as fast as I could, but if you have any questions, please let me know.
Discussion.
One clarifying question. What is the required amount of fund balance for city governments to have?
Yeah, of course, I think it varies from city to city. There are metrics,
Okay.
right, that are available, and most cities, different cities have, a policy that kind of dictates that. Councilman Taylor, I think, is still here, right? Yeah. So He, and the previous finance committee, helped us back in 2019, 2020, to kind of identify what we felt like was a good database to kind of measure where we are and those metrics, and we've kind of kept that up. So somewhere in the, as it relates to the general fund, I would say somewhere in the 28 to 30% range would be a target. And, you know, and then some, that's a really good question. You know, some cities also have a policy that might address the fund balance requirements in debt service, right? Some people say, well, we want a year of debt service coverage. Some people say, well, we want a half a year. It varies from city to city.
So our city hasn't reduced any of that to writing or to policy?
It's certainly been reported in the annual audit. It's been reported at the the budget and finance committee. Is it
We create a report annually.
Credit report based on targets, there's no
Yeah.
specific policy of what requirements
Yeah.
we have to have.
right?
The only requirement that we have, and I can't remember the exact percentage, is debt service or property tax. I think it's 26 or 27%. It can't exceed that.
That's our
Okay.
policy.
It's what now?
I think it's 26 or 27% of our revenues.
Yeah, I think there is there's a debt, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
There's a debt service, funding requirement, yeah.
I just knew that the school systems had to maintain 3% in fund balance. So I didn't know if there was a rule for
To the best of my knowledge, there's
municipalities.
not any type of,
Okay.
policy like that for
Yes,
municipalities.
municipalities around here that have zero fund balance. They're
Yeah,
just-
Yeah.
it really is a wide variety of,
Well, I guess just so piggybacking on that question, I'm just trying to figure out what are we managing against? And so piggybacking on that question, if 27, 28 is where we think we need to be, then the administration has concern with a budget that leaves us with 22.3?
you know, I think a lot of it I think you have to kind of view that with kind of what the city's mid to long-term plans. You know, there are going to be years that for whatever reason, you know, that percentage may go up or down. I would say this, and, you know, trying to answer your question with, you know, based on what I think I know. I would be a little, possibly concerned in that if we were to move forward like this, and we may also anticipate, a debt issue early into the, new fiscal year or something, how the credit agencies may view that, possibly. Although we may have a question about that from them, but.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just one final question. The reason I ask is because the budget's presented, but there's also additional revenue mechanisms that were presented at the same time. And so what I'm trying to understand is you know, obviously you could pass the budget, as I understand it, as is, as presented, without a tax increase and without borrowing money. But if you do that, you're gonna be at 22.3%. And so what I'm trying to figure out is, you know, is administration okay with a 22.3, or is this hey, it's 22.3, here's some funding mechanisms, we really think there needs to be some revenue added? That's what I'm trying to understand.
I guess it's the purpose of this committee and our council to make that determination of what the comfort level is on that, going forward.
Okay.
You know, we're at a very critical time as our region is growing, and if we're just kind of just keeping up with stuff, you know, instead of being kind of progressive with our city, moving it forward, because we have a lot of things on our, I think, on the horizon that we need to be prepared for, and, you know, there seems to be an opportunity for some additional revenue.
Bobby, can you help me understand the the drop in debt service. I don't know what page it was on.
Yeah, we can
Bobby.
look at, this, we can look, right here on page,
Is this in the,
it's in the ordinance, it's the easiest way to,
okay,
easiest way to see it. Yeah, it all
Here it is, page
evolves
5.
around the structure of the 2019 bond issue, which was the last bond issue that we had, how that,
The refunding also.
yeah, and the refunding was in there as well, and then there was $5 or $6 million of new money, and when, at that time, just like our advisors would do, if we were to consider a new debt, they looked at the existing debt service at that particular time and our capacity. And some people like to front load that, some people like to back load it, some people like for it to be as level as it can possibly be from year to year.
right.
And this is just where we landed, and you can see the principal on that debt issue dropped from 8.5, which it's been high. I mean,
Right.
matter of fact, we had to increase the allocation to debt service it was this year.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, so the debt service has been quite high since we procured that financing back in 2019. Well, we're 5 or 6 years into it now, and it's kind of where it drops off, and it kind of levels off the rest of the issue.
So that was my question, right? What does 26 look like? I mean,
A little less.
Yeah,
so
Yeah,
the trend line would be downward.
it's flat to downward from here on out.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's nothing at the back end of
No,
any of those.
no,
that-
we didn't
I think
backbone.
we get to 2038, 2039, I think the complete,
Yeah.
if we stay on this path, the complete debt service payments like
Yeah,
just shy of 3 million,
Okay.
yeah.
maybe just shy of 2.
And so again, I'm trying to put numbers back in here. So let's just assume we did the 10. And I know that projection was in here somewhere as to what what would the debt service payment be?
It's more
Well,
than that, 15 divided by 15, total amount by 1510, so
Yeah.
then just
This amount? divided by-
the number, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, while you're doing that, as our debt is sort of structured right now, 6.5 million next year, 6.4 million, 6.4, 4.7, 5 million, 4 million, 4.7, 4.1. You get down to less than 3 million, and as it stands right now, I think it's, my eyes are tired, but somewhere around FY 39, I think that's what the mayor said. Yeah, it's paid off. So.
Okay.
Mayor, you'll go, got it out there as quickly.
Yeah, no, it's good.
So the proposal from the mayor's office is to do this, and we just take it out of the general fund and.
Well, we had to put something in the ordinance, and so this is not, contrary to what some believe, this is not a dictatorship.
Yeah.
This is a process while we have a budget committee, while we have a council. And so what Bobby and I discussed is that, we wanted to provide the option so we could collectively come to a decision on what's best for the city and what's best for the people that we serve, as opposed to the mayor's office administration going, this is what the ordinance is and it's written in stone. This is why everyone is elected and everyone's serving in these positions, so we can come to a collective decision.
We have to have two readings, you're right, everything you said is right, and you have to have two readings of it, so we had to prepare something for the first reading, which is what this is.
Bobby, I think what I heard you say on the debt side was that you would, best practice would be you would leverage this debt for, I don't want to call them appreciable assets, but but long-serving assets over at least the tenure of the term.
Well, yeah, you kind of look at the assets, that you would be financing and you get the average useful life. And I guess, Dave, what I really am suggesting is, that's what most cities do
Understood.
and have to do, and that it kind of makes sense that you would recognize, that expense over the life of the asset.
Right. And so as I'm looking at the capital outlay that's proposed, the total expense of that is shy of the 10 million that was shown, right?
Well, actually, if I'm understanding where you're going, you're kind of looking at the total. There's actually funding, either from our fund balance and carryover items or grant revenues for what you're looking
Yeah,
at right
on
now.
the spreadsheet, the total
Yeah.
funding is 14 and some change, and then what we have that's not carryover is just around 9 million and some odd dollars. I can't remember the exact dollar.
Well, actually, if you look on page 8, on this spreadsheet, yeah, I think, Mary, you were doing some math in your head. Just to be clear for everyone, if you look, there's a column kind of in the middle, it's kind of a shaded column. It says FY carryover, FY '24 carryover. The total requested on those types of items are $3,246,000, and then the capital budget for next year was $14.8 million, the non-carryover items. And I guess the way you're looking at it, Mayor, is we've got, of that total, we've got, if I can find it, of that total, we're funding, we're funding, 6.5 million of that total.
Correct,
Yeah.
because that's
Right.
the difference between the total and the grants.
Well, it's a difference between the fund balance that carried over from the previous year
Plus the
and
grants.
plus the revenue, yeah.
Bobby, if you had to make a decision, I'm just curious.
Well, that's fine. I can give you Bobby's opinion, and when you heard Bobby's opinion, you've heard Bobby's opinion. But, so, I do think that this idea of financing, long-term, assets over time, that's how the world operates, in government and non-government. Did this at the hospital many times. That's the way it works. That's the way it should work. I believe strongly about that. We know in our homes and we know in our businesses that in today's world, costs go up, right? And they have been going up, and inflation. So I do think over time, the city should have a plan to grow, hopefully growth in population and business will help grow revenues to some extent. It's hard to predict exactly, how much that's going to be. The reality of municipal government is, I won't get these numbers exactly right, but between, so property taxes are probably, $36 million. I think that's about right. State shared revenues along with local sales tax and those type of things are, another, similar number, maybe $40 million. So of our $90 million revenue budget, that's the sources for 80% or more of it. And so I do think, you have to have that balance between cost increases, whether it's to provide services, to recruit and retain employees. You have, or inflation, that growth over time, you have to have a revenue source, to fund that. So that's my opinion, my thought.
Bobby, Mayor, could there be, just in looking at the long-term growth instead of looking at how can we have the least amount of dollars that we owe, can we do like a family does, to where we have a budgetable amount of dollars that we can know that we can rely on, a percentage of a budget, to where if there ever had to be some other source of revenue, that it was built into the plan to where we have money to grow.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well,
Like an emergency fund.
well, I'm thinking of knowing that,
That's what fund balances are, yeah.
where there may be just part of the growth of the city where there is an increase in the tax base. We know it's gonna come from building new homes, more people shopping, but then putting it as part of our plan that at some point, there may need to be a tax increase. I know that's a bad word, or words.
Yeah, that makes people, say progressive, you're 2 for 2 right now. All of that words.
Yeah, I know.
That's funny.
Well, I think, you know, I think in looking back, real world scenario, ideal world, and previous council and I discussed this, of ideally, to grow and plan that growth, what you would do is, as we've seen in the past, up until 2 years ago, certified rate was usually like 5 or 6 cents.
Mhm.
Where our last certified rate was 35 cents. That's a huge difference.
Yes.
And so that's not a reasonable, to keep up with the growth plan. That was the conversation that we had, was maintain the rate that we had prior to a certified rate, which would just be 5 or 6 cent different. That would help with the growth. When we had such a huge drastic change in that, then we couldn't, there wasn't a justifiable way to do that, and a good method to do that. And so the council and I elected to adopt the certified rate, just because residential properties went up so much in value. Even adopting the certified rate still increased the burden on people, because their property values were so much higher because of the imbalance of commercial and residential properties. And so we tried our best in those conversations of how do we balance that out without overburdening people at the time, especially residential property, and then maintain the certified rate without looking at that growth, just because it was such a shock to everybody at that point.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the COVID years, and combined with the reappraisal process that the mayor spoke to, has made for some interesting 4 or 5 years. So, you know, ARPA funds and other COVID dollars and so forth, there were limits on how those could be used, right? And the part that was a little bit unexpected was with all of the recovery dollars and incentive dollars that was circulating in the economy, right? And the panic buying and the fact that people had money in their pockets, you know, it was the big increase in sales tax that both at state and local level, and there were no restrictions on, you know, how you could use those funds. Now, you know, I can remember 2020, whenever COVID started, Mayor, I'm sure we sat together and we were so fearful of our sales tax was gonna take it. And we depend on the sales tax, and with COVID and all the restrictions and so forth, you know, it's gonna go down. Well, it did just the opposite. But now, we're from 23 to 24, sales tax revenues look a whole lot more like, now they stayed kind of where they were, right? But the increase looks more like it's been historically, maybe 1% in 24 over 23, and that's kind of what we're looking at in 25 over 24, kind of a 1%. Well, we depend on sales tax, as an example, for so much, and that growth is not there, right?
Yeah, and back to your question, Frank, about ways of growth. There's one thing, I'm open to any conversation that we have about how we manage that. One thing that I will not be in favor of, and consistently not be in favor of, is increasing the burden on our employees to offset not raising any revenue. We have to maintain our pay progressions for our employees. We're competing more with private sector. I'm not in favor of, and we'll never be in favor of transitioning and transferring more of our healthcare burden onto our employees. And I'm in favor of continuing to pay our employees. I mean, we're just now getting to the competitive rate, not even to where, we have to make sure that we're providing services to people, and people provide those services to people. Of the total expenditures of our budget, the 98 million, 69 million of that is personnel. I will not be in favor of reducing our personnel. They provide services. I will not be in favor of cost shifting and burden shifting to our personnel and to our employees to be able to make a budget match up. That's just for me. Now, there are 9 of y'all and there are 1 of me, but for me, that's a non-negotiable to transferring that burden onto our employees.
Well, I think that's very important, and as well as the importance of police and fire, our safety. So would it, what do you want to say?
I was just gonna, the mayor mentioned, the cost of our employees and, salaries are part of that, and we do have to be competitive, but also the benefit package, you have to be competitive there as well. The way these numbers are looking right now, for instance, on the health plan, projected kind of budgeted numbers, you see how they play out based on what the costs are and employees and so forth. But the city's funded about 81% of the cost of the health plan, and employees are funding about 19% of that, which was, I understand, historically, that's kind of been the targeted range for that cost sharing.
So long-term, and as it relates to revenue, what you're projecting is that we won't have an increase in sales tax revenue.
A small one.
We'll only have a small one. I understand you said that at several meetings. So we only have 2 options here, the 2 options that you propose.
Well, back on the sales tax part, right? So, certainly if we have, population growth and retail growth, that will result in increases in sales tax. Sort of the way that works is, the state, they do their projections for their budget on sales tax, and they make recommendations for cities and counties, and generally, as far as increases, and generally, we follow those, which is kind of where the 1% for next year comes from. But again, if the population grows and the retail grows, then sales tax would grow. There would be some growth in sales tax, and the state sales tax is allocated on a per capita basis or a per person basis is the way that works. So
are you optimistic about that?
About the growth?
Sales tax growth?
Well, I'm optimistic about the growth, yes, some
Okay.
growth. I'm not,
It's hard to put numbers to it.
yeah, it's hard to put numbers and how much and when, but
With the construction of homes and apartments and the property tax, do we expect there at some point be a windfall where we begin to reap more benefits from
That
these
growth.
additional homes?
well, here's the way, windfall might be
A little
a little
too much.
strong, but, historically, like this year, the information we received from the assessor's office, for the 2024 taxes, which will fund our 25 budget, right, the ones that come out this fall, because of more taxable properties being on the tax, parcels on the tax roll, and then, the appraisals have been higher. So like, this budget has, I think it's about if I remember right, in total, about a 1.6% increase in property tax growth, from 20. So, and normally, that was $600,000 or $700,000, and that's kind of what it's been year over year since I've been here with the city, which have kind of been normal growth years. Now with everything that's going on and the expected growth, you would think that number would increase.
You would think it would, as long as we continue to improve zoning and getting stuff done and all of that. But I mean, most of the people, they complain about our parks, or they complain about our streets, or they complain about police not having enough, not having this, not having that. It's, a lot of it, I feel like, we know what we need. We're not being irresponsible with the things that they're requesting. There's gotta be a way to fund it, and, you know, people always want something until it affects their back pocket.
Would,
Do they really want it?
Bobby, is there a way that we can begin to look at, say we put together a little commission of future funding? Are you flinching there?
No, actually, what I was just trying to think, really, I think you're asking good questions, and really what you're describing, and I do think this is important, and that is to say, okay, kind of here's our baseline, here's where we've been historically, kind of here's where we are, and here are the top priorities, you know, whether it's that the mayor's leadership and the council, you know, kind of agree on, as far as the mayor was speaking to recruitment and retention of employees who provide the services, and public safety's been mentioned, and roads have been mentioned, and parks have been mentioned, and all those things that we know are out there. And you begin to put together, first off, these are our priorities, you know, but then we begin to put together a plan.
Right.
A kind of short-term, mid-term. You can't get too far out, right? And then you sort of look at our financial performance, and you begin to see where there are gaps in there, you know, and the funding requirements. And then you kind of tell the public, this is how we hope to fund this. So you have a plan and do, you know, just some framework to what you're describing is kind of the point I wanted to make.
If we borrow it, what's an amortization schedule gonna look like? How long?
On the debt. It depends on the life of the assets that you're financing, combined with your existing debt service.
And I was leading to the question.
So for instance, the last,
Sorry, Frank.
No, you're good.
the
No, it's
last
good.
debt issue, you know, basically, we did that in 20, I think, when it finally happened. So that debt's retired. I think it had like a 17-year, it depends on the assets, basically.
What's the rate going on stuff like that?
Well, it's hard to say. It kind of depends on what type of financing, like a bond, a municipal bond, or a capital outlay note, or a private place. I think right now, 3 to 4%. But it kind of depends on our credit rating, and we could pretty quickly get some firm numbers.
And my thoughts were, if we approve this budget, put together a mayor's commission or something to begin to look at how do we fund some long-term things, understanding that those things have a long life, and that we fund those over a longer period of time.
If we were to have a growth, you know, a substantial growth of people and revenue and taxes and everything's coming in, is there usually any penalty on those if we did like early payments to knock it out quicker?
It depends on, yeah, there can be.
Depends on the bond issue, yeah.
Depends on the type of financing and the lender, but yeah, there can be. But, there's arbitrage. I mean, if we had a growth in revenue, you can invest that, and
But let's look at the reality of the numbers. I think that's one thing I've talked with several people, and they were, you know, they think you can write enough parking tickets to fund 2 full-time positions. It's just unreasonable. You look at a base price of roughly a home worth $250,000, 2,700 homes would generate about $2.2 million in property taxes. That's almost 3,000 new homes have to generate that amount of property taxes
And
for
that's
a
at
home.
what price point?
About 250. You gotta look at the economies of scale, what that growth is too.
So I think, the Mr. Chairman, what's needed to go to council?
Well, a budget
Well, no, but,
to pass.
well, I just think,
A recommendation from the budget committee needs to go to council for council to, hear the recommendation and then can make their decision based on the recommendation as well.
Are you about to make a recommendation?
well, I've been fishing, trying to get some information on, do we need extra revenue to go with the budget recommendation or not? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Because it'd be real easy just to approve the
The budget.
ordinance
Mhm.
as presented.
You know, I would say this, if the budget should be approved as is, you know, we would likely be having this discussion again next year. You know, you can't,
Mhm.
you can't continue to spend your fund balance indefinitely. So, that's just I'm not a member of the committee, but I think that's pretty clear to
It's
everybody.
very evident that
Yeah.
this is
Well-
what we'll be doing every year.
Well, I think just from a timing standpoint, right, I don't know how long it takes to get firm offerings back on long-term debt.
Yeah, so timing standpoint, so the way this is, the only thing that would be affected, right, is if you change the revenue piece. If we're looking at a bond issuance, then the capital budget still stays the same for the purpose of passing the budget. And if we look at a bond issuance or a debt issuance, then that comes after the fiscal year starts, and that gets added to as an amendment.
Which, that would work.
So, Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to approve this budget ordinance for FY '25 as presented.
Okay. Is there a second?
I have a question, just clarification. So approving the bond ordinance, approving this ordinance would include a proposal for a bond or tax increase? Got a little confused.
No, not as it's written.
Okay,
That's, we talked about that, that's normally not, part of it could have been, but let me say this, I think in order for that to have been part of the ordinance, we would have already had to have gone through all of the process with the comptroller's office to have the debt approved, right? Because I failed to mention that part, there are, I think it'd be fine, but there's a formal process that you have to go through with the comptroller's office to have a debt issue approved, so that would be the first thing we would have to do.
okay,
But that happens after our new fiscal year starts.
okay. I second it.
Good question.
Second? All right, there's a motion, second. Any other discussion? Johnny, are you there? Julie, any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. We have a budget to present.
A recommendation.
Recommendation, yeah. Any other business? Bobby, thank you. Mayor, thank you.
Thanks.
That was coming.